Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Leaders in Supply Chain podcast. I am your host, Radu Palamariu, Managing Director of Elcat Global.
Delighted to have with us today a great guest. We have Tariq Farooq, who is the SVP Global Supply Chain at Sanofi, joining us. He's been working with Sanofi for quite a while, based out of Geneva, Switzerland, for the last 4 years and leading the supply chain for the whole company. Long-standing career across supply chain, previously with Danone for many years, as well as with Procter & Gamble. He did a lot of work around FMCG, around transformation, around healthcare, around life sciences. And today we're going to be speaking around what and how made him successful. But first and foremost, maybe let's start by getting a little bit your inputs to Tariq into how did you end up in supply chain in the first place? And particularly on the second point of that question, how did you also make that transition from FMCG to healthcare?
Well, first of all, it's a great privilege to be with you and your listeners, Radu. So thank you for inviting me, and apologies that I'm on the telephone. We still need to do a lot clearly in digital within Sanofi that I can't make it work from my laptop, but apologies for that. So yes, so to come to your question, maybe just a quick intro on me then. So originally my family are from India and Pakistan. I grew up in the UK. Like many of your listeners, I studied engineering and then had the privilege of starting my career with Procter & Gamble and spent 19 years with them in a variety of different operations roles in supply chain, manufacturing mainly. And then from there moved to Danone, the French food and beverage multinational, which was a very interesting, that was back in 2010. Very interesting time to join the dairy business. Interesting in the sense that the dairy business was starting to struggle. The volumes dropped a lot for many of the branded players, Danone being one of them. So we saw many challenges in terms of having to redesign our networks, optimize our networks, downsize in various places to better adapt to the realities of the marketplace. Spent 7 years there, 3.5 years in the dairy business and 3.5 years in the waters business. And then to your point, had the privilege of having the opportunity to join Sanofi in Pharma, completely different from FMCG or food and beverage, whatever you want to call it. And I would say a few things. One, populated, particularly in supply chain, by equally great people. I think the talent, the passion that people in supply chain and pharma has is no different to what you would find in any other industry. That being said, it's a very different environment, certainly from the one I experienced at Procter and at Danone. Different because it's much more highly regulated, as you would expect, given its drugs, and therefore can take much longer to do things. So the time to change, even basic processes or materials or equipment, is much longer than it would be in my past life, simply because the degree of qualification, validation, external validation by health authorities takes longer. And therefore, it can be a bit frustrating when even to make a simple change, which in Procter or in Danone, you're only constrained by, do you have the money and do you have the people to do it? Here, there's all that broader regulatory frameworks. And that's one challenge. I think the other difference that I found in pharma was that the pressures on the industry, and certainly on Sanofi, had not been the same as the ones that I'd experienced in FMCG prior to that. And by that, what I mean is pharma, much later than FMCG, started to see margin pressure, right? I mean, pharma industry, I won't share the gross margin numbers because it'll make people feel ill. But the gross margins in the pharma industry, of course, are much, much higher than they are in the other industries that I mentioned. That's changing. The pressure on governments, the pressure on healthcare providers, the pressure on all of us to reduce the cost of medicines, the pricing of medicines, increase the availability, means that the kind of margin pressure we're starting to see is the kind of margin pressure that other industries saw 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago. So that's one. Secondly, in that same way, the cash pressure is going up exponentially versus the past. Now, I'll give one anecdotal point on that. When I joined Sanofi, I was surprised that we measured our inventory in months on hand and not the days on hand, which I was used to, which also shows a different viewpoint or mindset on how much inventory that we hold. Partly because the pressures were not the same, but partly also because you absolutely cannot afford to have a patient not having the medicines that they need when they need them. And then last but not least, I would say that the expectations of customers in particular were not as demanding as other industries have seen over time. Okay, and I give an example. I mean, for anybody who's worked in FMCG, you know that if you have to deliver to Tesco's, Carrefour, Walmart, or whatever, they will give you a 30-minute slot of when you need to deliver, right? And if you come 1 minute before, you were early, and if you come 1 minute later than that 30-minute slot, you missed your slot. Whereas when you're delivering to a pharma wholesaler, a pharmacy, a hospital, many of those slots are measured within days, if not, you deliver within the week. So therefore, the pressures that FMCG and food and beverage saw many years earlier were not there in pharma up until not that long ago. And therefore, the environmental pressure for supply chains in pharma to adapt, to evolve to the same degree of agility, responsiveness, cost control, cash control, customer centricity were not there. Not because the people are not smart, but just because the environment didn't force us to get there. And I think what we've seen over the last few years is those same external pressures coming to bear. And certainly over the last 2 years, as we've all been, working through the challenges of the COVID environment that we live in, some of those pressures have just exponentially increased. And we can talk more about that. So I think it's that there are some big differences between the industry and my previous ones. But to come back to your previous question, I think it's a very interesting time for anybody who's interested to join pharma, because there's a lot to be done. There's a lot of opportunity. And I think the demand for innovation, whether that's innovation in how we do our planning, how we do our manufacturing, how we do our customer engagement, how we manage our logistics, the need for innovation there is just huge. An interesting, exciting area to be in. It's outstanding. And the last thing I would say, with due respect to my past life and my past colleagues, of course, when you're talking about supplying medicines, then the patient level impact of not having the medicine there is far greater than the consumer impact of not having your shampoo or your yogurt or your bottle of water not being there. So therefore, the need for very high levels of service, for obvious reasons, are different.
No, that's an excellent summary. And we've actually seen quite a few extremely sharp professionals like yourself make this transition toward healthcare pharma in the last couple of years, specifically for the motives that you highlighted now. The industry is at the crossroads. And also quite a few of them, one of the reasons that they shared, and I think it's a valid reason on top of the list that you added, it's a lot more easier to make a bigger dent, right? I mean, in an FMCG industry where maybe you can save 1 or 2 more cents or whatever it might be that measure the impact. Whereas in pharma, in healthcare, in life sciences, there's such a big area and gap that can be improved, and it's being improved, that also that impact is immeasurably higher, or can be immeasurably higher. And on that point, I wanted to actually link now to that transformation, especially with COVID, with people, patients buying from home, doing telemedicine. We spoke a little bit in preparation for this about Omnichannel, right? And how Sanofi has developed strategies around that. So maybe tell us more on that point, Tariq.
Yeah, I think as we've all seen during COVID, consumers' habits have changed dramatically, right? I mean, we all know that if you look over the last 2 years, the rate of increase in online and e-commerce and so on has expanded in the last 2 years more than it did probably in the last 5 to 10 years. And that's not just happened on, the day-to-day products that all of us buy, but also on medicines. And then to your point, I mean, 2 interesting points I'd make. One is, let's take the UK. Prior to COVID, if I remember rightly, only 4 to 5% of general practitioner meetings with patients were done through some kind of online portal. 95% were face-to-face. Of course, during COVID, that flipped because, first of all, doctors were not so willing to have tons of people to come into their surgeries. And also people, were not so willing to do that. So that flipped, and you had much, much higher percentages of people connecting with their doctors online. And nowadays, with smartphone, you can turn the camera, you can show the doctor the rash you have on your arm, or you can point the camera at your throat and show the redness in the back of your throat or whatever you have. So for many of the day-to-day ailments, that's worked very well, and that shift will continue. And now I think the predictions are that probably 20 to 25% of GP sessions will be done online in some way. For other more complex issues, of course, you need the face-to-face. So what that then drives is, if I'm one of those patients who I connect with my doctor in that way, and the doctor is able to send me via a link or via an email or whatever, the prescription, but then I still have to take that bloody prescription into a pharmacy, that's frustrating. right? Because everything else that I buy, whether it's my, if I'm buying stationery, food, clothing, electronics, whatever it might be, I can go onto Amazon or any other, providers, decide, pick what I want, click the button, it's delivered within 24 hours or even faster. But for my medicines, I can talk to my doctor now, but I still need to physically go to a pharmacy. That's frustrating for people. So that the expectations there on, look, I want it delivered to my home, have gone up dramatically. So therefore, we're doing much more, when we say omnichannel, we're doing much more e-commerce and much more direct delivery to patient. Now, most of that, we don't do that ourselves. We do that through online pharmacies and external providers. So that's one big change that we're seeing. The other big change, to your point, is that for those people who are battling with more complex medical issues like oncology or really difficult, challenging issues for which they need to normally go into a hospital to have an injection on a regular basis or to have an infusion, again, in the COVID context, those people who are perhaps more vulnerable than the rest of us also feel more fearful to go into the hospital because they might catch COVID, right? Because they're immunosuppressed and so on. So for those patients, we also then had to work with some external partners to say, okay, how can we deliver those injections, those infusions to the person's home? So we're doing a lot more of that as well. And by the way, that's also a big help, not just for the patient, but for the hospitals, because then they're not tying up beds and doctors' time to do those kinds of things, and they can spend more time, unfortunately, having to deal with COVID patients or other more complex issues. So that's a big change that we're having to work through as well. And then the third big change that we've seen over the last couple of years is on some of the more chronic conditions. Let's take diabetes. Nowadays, you see lots of technology around where people are not having to take their blood, their sort of pinpricks and check their sugar levels. They have, special devices that are linked that they can put on their arm that's constantly measuring that, which tells them what their insulin levels are. They can track what they're eating. They can manage very well their condition, right? But then the frustration is, I have all of this technology, but then when I need to go and get some more insulin, I still need to go to the bloody pharmacy or whatever to get it. So now what we're doing through our virtual healthcare tools is to link all of what I've just said to their phone. They can track how much insulin they've got sitting in their fridge. And when that level, a bit like a basic Kanban, gets to a certain level, it prompts an automatic replenishment, again, not from us directly, but through some of our partners, and then they have more insulin delivered to their home. So when I say omni-channel, it really for us means going beyond shipping to hospitals or shipping to distributors or shipping to wholesalers or even shipping to pharmacies, but how do we deliver to people in their homes, whether it's servicing a prescription, whether it's servicing a more complex infusion, or whether it's providing ongoing replenishment of insulins or cardiovascular drugs which people need day in, day out. So that's been the big change for us. And again, even before COVID, we were seeing slowly those needs rising, but of course during COVID it's gone up exponentially. And once the genie's out of the bag, it's difficult to put it back in, because all those people who are now enjoying those benefits are now not suddenly going to say, I'm happy to go back to the old ways of working. They want more and more. So I think, many of those dynamics, as I mentioned before, if you make the analogy with FMCG or electronics or retail, many of those dynamics and expectations of consumers to have ease of supply, which have been there in those industries for many years, are now accelerating due to the COVID pandemic within pharma as well. And therefore, it becomes even more incumbent on us in these industries and then in Sanofi and particularly in supply chain of figuring out how to service that need and to do it better and better while still trying to be as efficient as you can be.
And I guess a question that comes to my mind, and to your point, we've seen it everywhere. People will not go back to old behaviors, right? E-commerce has seen tremendous growth across the board. So they do for medication, right? Maybe people that were not online and now they got used to online, they will not go back necessarily to supermarket, to hospitals, to so on, to your point. Now, my question, however, to dig a little bit and double click, because it's a huge shift in an organization that was used to a certain way of operating, right? Like Sanofi, and like most, actually all companies were disrupted in COVID. I think nobody had an easy ride, right? What did you have to shift, right? To be fast, agile, move enough, right? Was it systems more? Was it mindset more? Because this adaptation to omnichannel is not easy to do, and you can't do it overnight, right? So I'm curious to see if there were one or two elements that made this more successful for you guys.
Yeah, I think it's an excellent question, Radu. I think one of the things that we've all learned during the pandemic is that some of the things that we historically thought took months or years, in the midst of a crisis, people get very focused. The bureaucracy disappears to some extent because we're all working remotely. And some of the things which normally slow us down disappear as well. That people have been much more empowered to go off and find solutions very quickly. So I think the challenge for us has been that we've ended up with the solutions that I mentioned, too many of, because we've ended up with teams in the UK, teams in China, teams in Brazil, going off and very quickly finding solutions locally, finding a local partner, working with a local partner who might have had a pre-existing set of capabilities, or finding a local partner who is excellent at the last mile delivery and saying, look, can you add this to your portfolio? And doing that very quickly. So I think the challenge for us has not been, the benefit of the COVID situation has been people have really quickly grasped the need to serve our patients, quickly figured out solutions locally that can best do that. And then the challenge for us has been more, how do we step back from that and say, okay, fine, now how do we understand what works well, and how do we find something that's scalable across regions and which is not just fast, but which is also sustainable from a cost and efficiency standpoint. Because when you're in the depths of the crisis and your focus is on making sure that you serve your patients, the cost question is not so critical at that beginning point. But if you're doing it for 1 or 2 months, fine, it doesn't matter what it costs, because what's important is that you improve people's lives. But if you're having to do it as a long-term sustainable thing, then you need to be efficient. So I don't know if that answers your question, but we were helped by the crisis because it really focused people's minds on what's really important rather than all the other crap that we have to deal with day in, day out. And then what we've had to do, after the first few months, and we figured out this is not going away, right? Then we've had to sort of step back and say, fine, let's figure out how we do this efficiently. Instead of having a local partner in every market or 3 partners in every market, how do we find a regional player that we can work with? How do we standardize the way that we execute these processes? What are the systems and the tools we need to put in place, which then allow us to be able to capture that demand and integrate that into our normal planning systems and tools? Because if you're doing it for 200, 300, 400 patients here and there, it's not a big deal. But when that turns to thousands or tens of thousands, then you need to scale it. So I think the COVID crisis has enabled all of us to be much more linked to our purposes in each of our companies to do things faster. And then the challenge becomes is how do you make that sustainable, efficient, and scalable as you move ahead, by linking into the systems and the processes and so on that you normally have to deal with.
And on the topic of systems and processes, I know you've had a somewhat different approach to planning and to working on your centralized planning function, right? So tell us a little bit about that. I found that quite interesting, and what it led to in Sanofi.
Well, look, in all humility, what we've done as a planning function, and particularly as we think about forecasting and so on, to anybody in FMCG or retail or high tech, they've been doing it for a long time. Okay, so I don't think we've done anything remarkable in that sense. It might be innovative for us, but it's a reapplication of best practice from outside. So to your point, what we've done is, rather than having every market do its own forecasting in small teams spread across the world, with a variety of different tools and capabilities behind that, is over the last few years, we have established a global analytics and forecasting team and center in Barcelona. We've brought in experts in AI, in statistics, in data analytics to help us to do all of the statistical forecasting and demand management, which used to be done in the markets. We've consolidated that globally into one location in Spain, and we do it all from there. So we've taken all of that work out from the markets, globalized it, brought in people, I think, who have the skill set to do it, given them the tools. At the same time, we've implemented Kinaxis as our end-to-end planning system, and then bolted on some statistical forecasting tools and starting to also leverage AI and so on. But by doing that, it's enabled us to reduce our forecast inaccuracy by more than 60-70%. And that's, again, not to be critical to anybody who was doing it in the past, but a few things have changed. One is you have more expert people doing that work. That's one. Two, they have better tools. And three, stopping people from adding value, right? What I mean by that, we've been very careful to say, look, you have for most of our products, the forecast is the forecast. Take it from the tool, don't touch it, because we've been able to show that most of the time when people think that they're improving it by adding something to it, actually they're deteriorating the quality of the forecast. So by having that sort of globalized and centralized approach, it's allowed us to improve our forecast quality, as I said, by quite a considerable amount over the last few years. And that's been it's been a big benefit for us. But again, in all humility, I think other companies and particularly other industries have been doing that for quite a while. It's not something radically new in that sense.
Most things aren't, right, Tariq? So most things in this life aren't. But yeah, the key is, and I think where credit, let's give credit where credit is due. The key is to make that change management work. And maybe let me zero in again, because I've seen, and this is a common problem or challenge when companies go through this phase of change. How do you get buy-in? How do you get stakeholders aligned? How do you get the organization to do it differently, right? So maybe tell us how you did it in Sanofi, because again, by and large, yes, it makes sense. By and large, most companies, top of the art, have decentralized planning. However, right, I'm sure that when you came up with the idea, a lot of people also said, yeah, but we've been doing it like this and it works, why change, right? So tell us a little bit about the specifics of the change management that you managed to put in place to make it successful.
Yeah, and what I'll add to that is where we've been successful and where we failed as well, and we need to do more work.
Please.
Okay, so when it comes to what I just mentioned, we did it in a phased approach. So we started by saying, look, for Asia, we're going to set up a regional center in Singapore. And we're going to do it just for Asia out of Singapore because it was fewer markets. Within the market still, we set up a small team there to do it. We didn't take out the people from the markets to start with. We used that as a proof of concept. And we could very quickly show, for example, in China, that the MAPE or the mean aggregate percentage error, reduced from 30+% down to 10 or 12%. So we could very quickly show that, it can work, it does work, and it gives a better outcome. And it then frees up people locally to do other things. So we started with that as I don't want to call it a pilot, because whenever you say pilot, it makes it sound like you're going to try it, and if it doesn't work, you're going to give up, right? So it was our lead model that helped us to learn our way into it, learn our way into the processes, learn our way into the tools, and learn our way into how we integrated all of that into our S&OP or IBP processes as well. And then we scaled from there to then say, fine, we're now going to create in Barcelona a similar team that does it for Europe, and then expand from there, take over the work that was done in Asia, and also do it for the other markets. So we've now expanded that to more than 100 markets, and we've rolled it out progressively, in clusters of markets, which we then shift to that center in Barcelona. So it has not been a big bang. It's, you prove your concept, you prove that your tools, your ways of working, and your processes work, and then you scale it by bringing groups or regions into that over time. So it took us, I would say, a couple of years to go from zero to having all 100+ markets in there. So there, I think it's worked well. Now, let's be fair. The other reason it worked well was because we switched off the old tools. So if you're in your market and you don't have FutureMaster or JD Edwards or SAP APO or Excel, let's be fair, which was probably the predominant tool, if you don't have those capabilities anymore, and importantly for Excel, you can't switch it off, right? You can switch off something, you can't switch off Excel. So the way to switch off Excel is being to redeploy those people. So there isn't anybody there anymore locally who's able to do it. And therefore the change management was somewhat, I don't say easier, because that was a deliberate choice and that's worked well. But you have to convince your business partners, right? And that's where having that proof of concept, that lead model really helps. And then you need to sort of, burn your bridges to some extent, whether that's in your legacy systems or if it's Excel, moving people to other things. Now, where we've been far less successful is at the other end of the value chain, is we've also then been, of course, using that demand data to propagate that back up the value chain into our plants and set up in the plants the same tools to say, okay, now you take that data and you do your production planning and whatnot. And there, to be honest, we're having to now redo it because I wouldn't say we failed, but we underestimated the challenge. Because the work that happens in the plant is more complex. It's not just, the forecasting you're doing, the rough cut capacity planning, the production scheduling, the MRP, the material call off, and so on. So there's a lot more to be done. But what we found there was that it was more complex because you simply couldn't just move the people out,
Yes.
for one. And secondly, when they had been using Excel and whatnot for such a long time, the quality of the master data in some of the systems, the quality of your bill of materials, for example, if you're doing something in Excel and your BOM is not right, you can adjust it quickly in Excel, or you remember, where it's wrong. But if you're now reliant on a system with the demand data coming in, you need to have all of that master data 1000% correct. Otherwise, you'll have shit coming out, excuse the expression. So we underestimated the work required on the data cleansing, not just of the transactional data, but of the master data. And we underestimated, after being so successful in the markets, of the change management that was required in terms of, one, convincing people to work differently, convincing people that they needed to be more disciplined in their management of data and the timing of when they were managing data, because it has much greater implications versus whatever you put into Excel and take out of Excel. And therefore, that has been somewhat more problematic. And we've had to go back and redo some of that work in the plants, and clean up the data and fix some of the process issues that we should have done from the beginning. So I think in the end, what it reinforces, and anyone who's done any kind of digital program will probably say the same thing, that in the end, only whatever it is, 15 to 20, 30% of your success is down to the tool. The bulk of the success is down to the quality of the data and the cleansing you do of it, and the quality of the engagement or change management, to your point, because in the end, it all comes down to whether people are going to operate in ways that you need them to operate, and whether they're going to stick with that over time, or if they revert back to their tool of choice, which tends to be Excel.
Yeah. Well, I'll share a funny story since we are on the topic. And funnily enough, it was a global, fairly large, not global, but fairly large regional healthcare distributor. And we were doing this search as the global or regional head of data management, something like that. So they were implementing their own systems. And the chief operations officer was saying, wow, we have so big issues in the quality of our data. And he said he had gone to some of the markets and he had found entries like Mickey Mouse, Winnie the Pooh. So, if there's any consolation, you're not alone. I think it's a fairly common problem. That being said, I love the recent metaphor that I learned myself from Donna Wharton from Microsoft. She said that for Microsoft, data is inventory. Data is inventory. I never thought about it like that, but Donna's point was that it's so crucial to have accurate data and data in and by itself for Microsoft. And by and large, I think for most companies, it can be the same. It's such an important asset if it's correct, right? So it should be treated like inventory and can be used like inventory. So I just love that, and I liked also the reinforcement. And okay, I think everybody's work in progress. Yeah, if anybody got it right, then okay. They should teach us, but I haven't quite found that one. Now, reaching to the last segment of our chat, because I really also want to get your perspective on skills, on people, on leadership in supply chain, Tariq. How do you see the type of capabilities and skills that will be the most needed in the profession for the executive of the future? Let's talk big things, right? What do they need, hard and soft skills?
If I think about supply chain overall, so not just execs, but across the organization, I would say probably there are many, but three come to mind straight away. One is linking back to what we just said, digital, right? The capability for people to be able to understand the tools that they're using and be able to leverage the functionalities and the capabilities that they provide. That's a big change. And, I make a simple analogy. If you're somebody working in customer service who for the last 10 years or 20 years has been taking orders at the end of a phone or at the end of a laptop or at the end of a fax machine, whatever it might be, and suddenly all of that now is automated and disappearing, and the work you're now having to do is very different. You're having to look at how do I better leverage the tool to give me the insights on where I have issues and where I need to intervene, to add value. That's a very different skill set to the purely executional one that people were doing before. So, having those capabilities become more and more important, for all of us. So that's one piece. And, all of us, however digitally capable we think we are, need to continue to adapt and learn to the tools, because our work will become more about how we bring innovation rather than how we day-to-day execute, because I hope that the tools will help us with the day-to-day execution more and more. So that's one piece. The second sort of skill that I think that we all need to get better at is our ability to collaborate and innovate as a result of that, whether that's internally across functions or that's externally with our suppliers and with our customers. I think, again, as the various tools we put in place give us more and more of the day-to-day activities being done almost automatically, our skills in collaborating and innovating become that much more important as we move ahead, right? Because it's what we can bring as innovations that will improve, small innovations, big innovations that will make the difference. And I think then the third one, which is particularly relevant, as we think over the last couple of years, from a leadership standpoint, is, for all of us, how we get better at leading distributed hybrid organizations. The days of everybody being in the office 5 days of the week is gone. We've seen that over the last couple of years. And there are, certainly if I think about Sanofi and, the global headquarters that I sit in here in Paris, I was going to say guidance. It's more than a guidance, it's a policy. People are expected now to be in the office 2 days a week. It's 2 days a week. It's not 5. Yeah. It's 2 days a week. You choose which 2 days it is. And of course, team by team, you need to make that work because, within a team, if you're all in on a different day, then it's not a team anymore. But then also as leaders, you need to, figure out how the hell to manage all of that, because it's one thing leading an organization which is all physically present. It's another thing leading an organization which is all physically dispersed when everybody is on Zoom. But it's a completely another thing when you have that hybrid that you need to deal with. And again, back to my analogy before, that genie's out of the bottle and it's not going back in, because we all recognize that, the way that we used to work was, perhaps a model from 50, 60 years ago, which we just snuck with. And it's not the best model as we move ahead. That's probably not the most effective model either for individuals who can then better manage their day-to-day lives. And certainly from a sustainability or an environmental standpoint, having, all of us continue to spend each day driving or metroing or whatever in and out of work probably isn't the best thing for the planet either. So I think from a work-life balance standpoint, from a environmental standpoint, and from an effectiveness standpoint, the sort of new hybrid ways of working are going to be much more effective. But for all of us, wherever we are in our companies, and whether it's supervisor roles or exec roles, doesn't really matter. All of us have to figure out and learn and develop our leadership skills to work in that new hybrid way. So I think if there were three, there are many, but if there were three, I would say it's skills and capabilities to not just implement, but leverage and continually improve on digital. It's our ability to collaborate and therefore to drive innovation, small and big. And it's our leadership skills and capabilities to be able to effectively operate in this new hybrid kind of world that we now live in. And I think all of us, across all the different companies are still trying to figure that out and trying to figure out how to most effectively, make that work.
Mm-hmm. Final question from me, Tariq. What's one motto, piece of advice, quote that has been most helpful for you in your career?
Oof, that's an interesting one.
Principle.
Yeah, and that's probably easy. I think for me, the principle would be try to make, a difference in whatever you do, small or large, right? Because wherever we are in our organizations, whatever level you sit at, whatever role you sit at, if you can focus on making a difference to the people that you serve, meaning your final patients or final consumers, and making a difference to the people that you work with, then in the end, that's, the biggest contribution that we can make. And if you do that well, right, and you continue to innovate, you continue to figure out how to improve the lives of your patients or consumers, you continue to think about how to improve and make a difference to those around you because of the ways of working, because of the processes, because of the tools, then that doesn't just improve the lives of those you serve, whether internal or external, but ultimately that improves the performance, the results of the organization, delivers, the stakeholder things that we work to deliver, shareholder value and so on. But I think if you focus on serving the people that you're supposed to be serving and do your best at that and continue to think about how to make a difference, then that's probably the best advice I would give to my teams internally. And that certainly, if I think about something that's helped me, over my 32 years now of working in operations and supply chain, that probably would be it.
Super. Well, on that note, much appreciate the time, the sharing, the many case studies, Tariq. Keep up the great work. I'm sure that, like a good friend was sharing that she loves supply chain because it's never boring. And I kind of challenged her and said, yeah, we should sure as hell would need some boring right now.
Yes.
So for sure you won't get bored this year either. It seems like it's going just a bit like before from one crisis to another. But best of luck. Keep the great work, the transformation at Sanofi, and stay healthy.
Hey, thank you very much. And again, thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. If you liked what you heard, be sure to go to www.elcotglobal.com and click the podcast button for all the show notes of the interview. Also, subscribe to our mailing list to get our latest updates first. If you're listening through a streaming platform like iTunes, Spotify, or Stitcher, we would appreciate a kind review. 5-star works best to keep us going and our production team happy. And of course, share it with your friends. I'm most active on LinkedIn, so do feel free to follow me. And if you have any suggestions on what to do and who to invite next, don't hesitate to drop me a note. And if you're looking to hire top executives in supply chain or transform your business, of course, contact us as well to find out how we can help.